The arrival of the grasshopper, December 17, 1944. The Ardennes forest slept under a brittle, thin snow. A low mist clung to the pines like breath. In a foxhole carved from frozen earth, Obergefreiter Hans Müller paused in his diary, the nib of his pencil trembling as if it too could feel the weight of what he had seen. "The Americans are not like the Russians," he wrote. "Their artillery is something else entirely. It is not the volume of fire, though that is terrible enough. It is the speed. It is the accuracy. It is the knowledge that you have no time to react." It began for many German soldiers with a small aircraft, a Piper L-4 Grasshopper. Light, slow, and seemingly harmless, it would become the most feared thing in the sky, not because of what it carried, but what it allowed to follow. From that simple observation platform flowed a cascade of innovations, procedures, and industrial capacity that together produced a lethal synergy. A modern artillery system capable of delivering near-instantaneous, precisely coordinated destruction. Scene: a frozen wadi north of Tunis. Spring 1943. Gefreiter Otto Schmidt remembers the first time he encountered American fire. Schmidt had served 2 winters on the Eastern Front and expected the pattern he knew. Ranging shots, a pause, the creeping build of fire that allowed men to seek shelter between salvos. Instead, he watched a grasshopper circle, then the world ended in 30 seconds. In a single instant, his company, 123 men, was reduced to 11 survivors. That gap in expectations, that difference in rhythm, became the defining shock for German troops fighting Western Allied armies. The Red Army's artillery, brutal and massive though it was, often warned its victims. The American system did not. Documentary voiceover. What German soldiers did not grasp at first was that the dominant element here was not one weapon, it was a system. The Americans had assembled a full stack: forward observation integrated with radio technology, centralized fire direction, pre-computed firing tables, motorized batteries, vast industrial output of guns and ammunition, and the variable time VT fuse. Combined, they formed a deadly apparatus that reversed the assumptions forged on the Eastern Front. Scene: a captured set of American firing tables spread across a cold wooden table. Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann runs his gloved fingers over them and finds the arithmetic terrifyingly precise. Across the United States, rooms full of women, clerks, mathematicians, engineers' eyes had spent long hours hunched over mechanical calculators and slide rules. They computed firing solutions for every conceivable combination of range, elevation, temperature, and wear. They printed dense volumes small enough for a map case and shipped them forward. The tables meant that once the observer radioed coordinates, the FDC could produce an accurate firing solution in minutes, not hours. But the ledger of calculations was only the start. Time on target, TOT, changed the tempo of warfare. Instead of a rolling, gradual barrage, TOT synchronized batteries so that shells fired from different ranges arrived simultaneously, within a 3-second window, on the target. To an infantryman used to the gradual approach of traditional barrages, the effect was apocalyptic. There was no warning, no chance to react. A single instant of silence followed by an instant of annihilation. Scene: a German platoon advancing through the Ardennes. They pause, thinking the morning dull. A grasshopper appears. Within minutes, trunks of trees snap and the world rains shrapnel. Journal entry: Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer. I studied their procedures in captured papers and thought it was propaganda. Then I saw it myself. Batteries coordinated, solutions calculated in minutes, and the shells arrived as if by magic. The American advantage lay not only in math but in communications. New FM radios provided clear, static-free voice links between forward observers and fire direction centers. Every infantry battalion had multiple radio-equipped observers. German units often had 1 or 2 worn sets. The FM network allowed for continuous coordination. The observer saw, called, and massed into effect. Consider the anatomy of a call for fire. The observer's voice, crisp and unchoked by static, gave precise map coordinates and target description. The Fire Direction Center, fed with pre-computed tables and trained crews, selected which batteries would fire, set the charge and fuse settings, and calculated precise azimuth and elevation. Trucks and half-tracks moved the guns rapidly into position. Motorization meant the Americans could displace, fire, and leave in minutes. For Germany, whose logistics still depended heavily on horses, that mobility was impossible to match. Scene: Rock Island Arsenal humming with activity. A montage of machine tools. Stampings, rivets, and rings of 155mm barrels. The narrator describes production figures. Thousands of guns, millions of shells. Production mattered. Where Germany's factories struggled under bombing, shortages, and bottlenecks, American industry moved with relentless output. Guns like the M2A1 105mm howitzer and the M1 155mm howitzer were produced in thousands. Ammunition poured forward. Where German batteries rationed rounds, American observers had virtually unlimited reserves to expend. That industrial safety net enabled tactics that transformed the battlefield. When a forward observer called for fire, he could call for the equivalent of multiple bomber strikes delivered from the ground. Massed volumes of fire that could be directed, timed, and fitted to the situation. American doctrine fused artillery to infantry operations in ways German doctrine had not anticipated. Scene: Oberst Heinrich Müller's after action, his regiment destroyed near St. Lo. He had watched an infantry company hold off his regiment, aided not by aircraft but by artillery called by a junior officer. The forward observer commanded more firepower than the entire regimental artillery he possessed, but perhaps the most terrifying element for German troops was the variable time or proximity fuse. Previously, shells used time or percussion fuses. Their lethality relied on accurate timing. The VT fuse returned the problem to the projectile itself. A tiny radar transmitter in the nose pulsed. When the reflected signal indicated proximity to the ground, the shell detonated at the optimum height to create an airburst, raining fragments downward. Airbursts were devastating because they struck men in shallow foxholes and trenches, negating the limited protection those shelters offered. The VT fuse had proven its worth in naval anti-aircraft use and against V-1 flying bombs over England, but commanders hesitated to use it against ground troops due to the risk of capture and reverse engineering by enemy forces. Eisenhower, however, understood the tactical advantage and pressed for its use once the Ardennes offensive revealed the need. Scene: December 1921, 1944. The formal authorization trickles down. VT-fused shells are approved for use against ground targets. German formations, already shocked by TOT, now face airbursts that make foxholes lethal. Soldier testimony, Gefreiter Paul Richter. We watched them fire, then trucks appeared. Within 20 minutes, the battery had limbered and moved. Our horses were still being harnessed. We were 19th century. They were the 20th. Psychology, too, became a weapon. The knowledge that there was no place, save reinforced overhead protection, to hide from airbursts shattered morale. Men would refuse orders to cross open ground, preferring capture to certain death under American fire. Unit cohesion frayed. Mutinies were narrowly avoided. The new reality rendered old training obsolete. Soldiers who had survived Eastern Front storms of shelling found their instincts betrayed by an enemy who rewrote the rules of engagement. Scene: A German battalion hesitates on a ridge. The commanding officer orders an attack. The men stand, faces in masks of fear. They refuse. A fragile, brutal calculus takes hold. Move and likely die, or stay and be captured. Scientific montage, diagrams explaining taut calculations, the physics of airburst lethality, and the internal components of a VT fuse. Engineers and mathematicians, often women working far from the front, combined to produce outcomes felt on the frozen soil of Europe. Interlude: Memory and Letters. Excerpts from captured diaries illustrate the human dimension. Hans Müller's final lines in Part 1: We were taught to fear bursts, to flatten ourselves to the earth. The shells that came for us that morning burst above our heads. We had no time. Part 1 closes on a single image: an empty foxhole rimed with frost, the body half buried, newspaper fluttering, and a distant tree smoldering, the silence after the storm. The narrative voice promises that Part 2 will follow the arc from tactical shock to strategic collapse. How the American artillery system not only killed men, but rewrote doctrines and hastened the disintegration of Germany's last offensive. Anatomy of a crushing advantage. The Ardennes would not be won by a single battalion or cannon. It would be suffocated by a network. communications, calculations, logistics, and munitions production working in concert. Part 2 traces the institutional mechanisms, the human stories behind them, and the consequences that spread beyond the battlefield into the political and industrial realm. Scene: an American Fire Direction Center, FDC, in action. A sketch of the process the observer calls. The FDC consults firing tables. The plotting boards are updated. Phones buzz. The battalion synchronizes. Here is the FDC's key insight. Centralization multiplies speed. German batteries calculated solutions locally. American batteries fed data into a central node where officers could mass fires across multiple batteries, adjust for environment, and sequence fire so that rounds from near and far arrived simultaneously. Interview excerpt, fictionalized composite of American artillery officers. We trained our men to think in terms of massed fires. One voice could move the weight of an entire artillery wing. The system taught them to trust numbers and time. The use of pre-computed firing tables deserves more attention. The tables, painstakingly calculated across laboratories and machine rooms, allowed crews to avoid repeated error-prone field computations. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department and private industry collaborated to churn out these tables, each entry encoding variables: propellant temperature, barrel erosion, wind, humidity, and more. When an observer reported coordinates, the FDC rarely had to calculate. It looked up and applied with a confidence that left little room for error. Scene: archivists later discover rooms filled with computing work. Women, mathematicians, college graduates, technicians, had produced the numerical backbone of U.S. artillery power. Their names rarely enter the history books, but their output made the frontline speed possible. Another pillar was mobility. Motorization turned artillery from a static defense into a fast reactive instrument. Trucks and half-tracks moved guns at highway speeds. Prime movers hauled ammunition. Engineering units kept roads cleared. By contrast, the German reliance on horses, a logistical anachronism stretched by the war, meant slower displacement and vulnerability to Allied air interdiction and poor winter roads. Scene: a montage contrasting a German horse-drawn battery laboring through mud with an American battery rolling up, firing and departing under its own power. Logistics fed the engine. Ammunition stockpiles, supply trains, depots, and a manufacturing base meant that American commanders could order fire without counting each round. Where German batteries were often on strict daily rations, American batteries unleashed storms of shells that made the enemy believe numbers were limitless. That perception, multiplied across multiple engagements, altered behavior on the battlefield. Scene: diary extract, Lieutenant Joachim Weber. We requested Corps artillery at 9:15. 4 hours later, 3 salvos arrived. By then the enemy had assaulted and withdrawn. The organizational differences mattered. German Corps and Army artillery lay outside the immediate control of divisional commanders, trapped by rigid command structures that slowed the deployment of heavy fires. American doctrine, born of different organizational choices, enabled fire to be pushed down to lower echelons quickly. The net effect was tactical flexibility at the point of contact. Yet technology alone does not win wars. Equally critical was training and doctrine. American forward observers were not merely artillery technicians. They were infantrymen first, schooled to move with units, understand terrain, and integrate fires with maneuver. They were empowered. A junior lieutenant could call devastating massed fires and see them executed within minutes. Scene: a forward observer embedded with infantry, moving in frosted hedgerows, eyes scanning, radio clipped. He is both warrior and conductor of iron. The VT fuse, introduced at scale in late 1944 and early 1945, amplified the lethality of TOT. The proximity fuse's radar logic made airburst an automatic outcome. In the Ardennes, once allowed for ground use, VT fuses created a new lethal geometry, fragments raining vertically into foxholes, cutting down men who thought they were safe. Military analyst voiceover. Studies after the war found that the majority of artillery casualties occurred in the first seconds of a barrage. TOT multiplied that effect, VT fuses multiplied it again. The combined probability of lethal wounding rose dramatically. Tactics predicated on short-term survival in shallow cover failed. Scene. Soldiers dig deeper, destroying log revetments, scavenging timber for overhead protection. But the time and materials required are unavailable in the fast-moving offensive. The Germans had planned for mobility and surprise. They had not planned for sustained overhead protection shortages in the face of massed Allied fire. The psychological dimension hardened. Men questioned orders. Units that might otherwise have counterattacked did not. Command structures frayed under the weight of new tactical realities. The Ardennes campaign, intended to split the Allied line and seize Antwerp, foundered against a systemized response that created local superiority of fires wherever it was needed. Scene. December 1944. German commanders watch in disbelief as their columns dissolve under artillery strikes. Communications fail. The cold bites. The plan, once elegant on paper, meets the brutal arithmetic of American material and coordination. But this was not merely a story of one campaign. The same artillery system shaped operations across Normandy, at St. Lo, in the hedgerows and in the bocage. In each place, American artillery, with its centralized planning, mobility, and munitions, broke German tactical expectations and created windows of opportunity for infantry and armor to exploit. An aside on ethics and escalation. The VT fuse had been a guarded secret because of fears of enemy capture. Granting its use was a conscious strategic choice by Allied High Command. In the Ardennes, Eisenhower's decision to apply this new technology on the battlefield was premised on the immediate tactical necessity, stopping a potentially catastrophic breakthrough versus longer-term security concerns. Historians debate whether the moral calculus was stark or obvious. For soldiers on the ground, the calculus was simple: live in the short term or die. Scene. A captured German officer writes to a family member after the war, attempting to explain how the world had changed. He struggles to name the components he saw. They used numbers and radios. They had shells that exploded like rain. We could not cope. American narratives often celebrate innovation, yet behind the triumph lay costs, the manpower and resources required to build and sustain such a system, the industrial labor of thousands at home, and the human toll inflicted on those on the receiving end. The script does not aim to glorify death. It seeks to explain causality, how a complex of small improvements stacked to produce decisive effect. Conclusion. Strategic consequences. By late 1944 and into 1945, German forces faced material attrition, a shortage of replacements, and command structures stretched to breaking. The American artillery system did not alone cause Germany's defeat, but it was a force multiplier that converted tactical engagements into cascading setbacks, where German doctrinal rigidity, logistical shortages, and industrial decline met the modern, flexible artillery of the Allies. The result was predictable: erosion of frontline cohesion and the loss of operational initiative. The Ardennes campaign stands as a case study. The German offensive found early success of surprise and initiative, but failed to consolidate against a responsive, industrially empowered enemy. Time on target, the VT fuse, FM radios, massed production, and centralized fire direction made the battlefield inhospitable to older forms of warfare. Epilogue. Memory and the last diaries. We close with fragments from the diaries recovered after the fighting. Schmidt's tally of those who lived. Miller's stunned hand describing the moment the world ended above him. Bauer's disbelief turned into bitter acceptance. They leave us with a sobering truth. War's technical revolutions transform not only weaponry but the very experience of being a soldier. Final image. Snow again. A cannon abandoned with its wheels half sunk. Printed firing tables fluttering beneath a branch. A grasshopper's faint silhouette traced across a pale sky. A small plane that delivered the seeds of destruction with nothing more than voice and number.